Chicago. Tuesday morning, 9:00 a.m. The 50th floor of a $10 million penthouse. Julian raised the heavy leather belt. His handsome face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Clara curled into a tight ball on the cold marble floor, wrapping her arms desperately around her pregnant stomach, closing her eyes as she braced for the agony she had endured for 2 long years. Blow never landed it. With a deafening explosion, the solid oak bedroom doors blew off their steel hinges, sending shards of wood flying across the room. Stepping through the settling dust was Dominic Russo, the most feared syndicate boss in the city. He didn't yell. He simply drew his weapon and put 3 suppressed bullets directly into Julian's knees. Julian collapsed into the shattered glass, clutching his bleeding legs and screaming in hysterical terror. "She's my wife. You can't take her. She's mine." Dominic holstered his smoking gun, his dark eyes dead calm as he looked down at the weeping billionaire. "A human being is not property, Sterling. The concept of ownership ends where a woman's right to breathe begins. How did a shattered high society wife become the absolute salvation of a ruthless mafia king? And what happens when the entire criminal underworld tries to tear them apart?" Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications right now, because this is a story of survival, revenge, and justice you will never forget. Clara woke up to the heavy, suffocating scent of expensive roses. It was a beautiful smell, but beneath it, sharp and unmistakable, was the metallic copper taste of her own blood. She lay perfectly still on the massive king-sized bed. The Egyptian cotton sheets were cool against her bruised ribs. She did not open her eyes immediately. She listened. Penthouse was entirely silent. It was the kind of deep, insulated silence that only $10 million could buy. Outside, the vibrant, chaotic heart of Chicago beat with life. But up here, on the 50th floor, the air was stagnant for 2 long years. Julian Sterling's magnificent penthouse had been her absolute prison. The world below saw a billionaire philanthropist. They saw a handsome real estate mogul who smiled for the cameras and donated to children's hospitals. Clara saw the monster holding the whip. She finally opened her eyes. The harsh morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The light reflected off the cold marble floors, casting sharp, blinding angles across the bedroom. Clara sat up slowly. Every movement was a calculated risk against the pain in her side. She looked at her reflection in the gilded vanity mirror across the room. She was a fractured silhouette against a golden cage. 2 years ago, she had been a pediatric physical therapist. She had a thriving clinic. She had friends. She had a life filled with purpose and laughter. Julian had dismantled it all piece by piece. It did not happen overnight. It was a slow, methodical poison. First, he convinced her that her friends did not respect her. Then, he bought her clinic and quietly liquidated it, claiming she needed to rest. He isolated her entirely. He gaslighted her until she could no longer trust her own memory. And when her mind was entirely dependent on him, the physical violence began. Julian had left the apartment an hour ago, before he walked out the door, perfectly dressed in a bespoke Italian suit. He had thrown a crystal whiskey glass at her head. She had ducked just in time. The glass shattered against the mahogany wall paneling, raining down like sharp diamonds. His reason for the outburst was trivial. The coffee was too bitter. Or perhaps she had looked out the window for too long. It no longer mattered. The violence was never about what she did. It was about control. It was about reminding her that she was nothing more than a highly decorative object he owned. Clara pushed herself off the bed. Her bare feet touched the freezing marble. She walked into Julian's private study to clean up the shattered crystal. She was not allowed to let the maid see the messes he made. She knelt on the floor. Her hands trembled as she picked up the sharp, glittering fragments. The sunlight caught the edges of the broken glass. She swept her hand under the heavy oak desk to reach a stray piece. Her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic that did not belong. She paused. Her breath caught in her throat. It was a hidden compartment. The impact of the heavy crystal glass had cracked the false wooden paneling beneath the desk. Clara looked at the heavy mahogany door of the study. Julian would not be back for hours. Her heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her bruised ribs. She wedged her fingers into the crack and pulled. The panel snapped off. Inside the narrow cavity lay a small, black, leather-bound ledger. It was locked with a digital biometric thumbprint scanner. But the casing was cracked from the impact of the glass. Clara used the sharpest piece of broken crystal and pried the damaged casing apart. The screen flickered, sparked, and bypassed the security protocol. The ledger opened. Clara stared at the glowing green numbers on the screen. She scrolled down, her eyes widening with every line. She had always known Julian was obsessed with money. But this was not a record of his real estate empire. These were encrypted offshore accounts, and they were completely empty. Julian Sterling was completely broke. Worse, the ledger documented a staggering list of underground debts. Her eyes locked onto a single, terrifying name at the bottom of the column: Silas Thorne. The name sent a chill down her spine. Everyone in Chicago knew that name. Thorne ran the largest illegal gambling and loan sharking syndicate in the state. Julian owed the Thorne syndicate $5 million. And the due date had passed 3 weeks ago. A wave of profound nausea hit her. Julian was a desperate man. A desperate narcissist was the most dangerous creature on earth. She closed the ledger and shoved it back into the hidden compartment. She replaced the broken wooden panel, her hands shaking violently. She needed to sit down. She stumbled into the master bathroom and gripped the edges of the marble sink. She stared at her pale, terrified face in the mirror. She felt incredibly sick. But the nausea was not just from the fear. It had been lingering for weeks. A sudden, paralyzing realization washed over her. She opened the bottom drawer of the vanity. Hidden beneath a pile of expensive, untouched silk scarves was a pregnancy test she had smuggled into the penthouse months ago, saving it for a moment of absolute necessity. Clara locked the bathroom door. Her hands were sweating as she tore open the plastic wrapper. The silence in the bathroom was deafening. She followed the instructions. She placed the plastic stick on the cold marble counter. She set a timer on her watch for 3 minutes. Those 3 minutes stretched into an eternity. She stared at the ceiling, pleading with a god she hadn't spoken to in 2 years. She could not bring a child into this hell. Julian would use a baby as the ultimate weapon. He would chain her to him forever. A child would become another object for him to control, manipulate, and destroy. The timer chimed. The sound was soft, but it echoed like a death knell in the quiet room. Clara closed her eyes. She took a deep, shuddering breath. She looked down at the counter. 2 pink lines. They were dark. They were unmistakable. She was pregnant. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her throat. She backed away from the counter until her shoulders hit the tiled wall. She slid down to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She wanted to scream, but she knew the soundproof walls would just swallow it. She was entirely trapped. She wrapped her arms protectively around her stomach. She had to run today, right now. She didn't have money. She didn't have a phone, but she had to try. Then she heard it. The heavy, distinct click of the front door unlocking. Julian was home early. Clara scrambled to her feet. She grabbed the pregnancy test and shoved it deep into the bathroom trash can, burying it under wet paper towels. She splashed cold water on her face. She tried to steady her breathing. She unlocked the bathroom door and stepped out into the bedroom just as Julian walked in. He stopped in the doorway. He did not look angry. He looked incredibly calm. That was infinitely worse. His perfectly tailored suit was immaculate. He loosened his silk tie and smiled. It was a cold, empty smile. He walked slowly toward the bathroom. Clara's heart stopped. She had forgotten to empty the trash. She had been too panicked. Julian stepped past her. He looked down into the bin. He reached in and pulled out the wet paper towels. He held up the plastic stick. The 2 pink lines glared in the bright bathroom light. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush her bones. Julian looked at the test. Then he looked at Clara, his handsome face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He was losing control. She had a life inside her that he did not authorize. She had something that was hers. "You stupid, careless woman," he whispered. His voice was soft, barely a hiss, but it carried the weight of a violent storm. He lunged. Clara didn't even have time to raise her arms. His hand clamped around her throat, slamming her brutally against the wall. The air was ripped from her lungs. She grabbed his wrists, kicking her legs, but his grip was like iron. He threw her across the room. She crashed into the heavy oak dresser and collapsed onto the floor. Pain exploded in her shoulder. She curled immediately into a tight ball, wrapping both arms desperately around her stomach. She had to protect the baby. Julian unbuckled his heavy leather belt. The sharp snap of the leather echoed in the large room. He stood over her, his chest heaving, his eyes entirely black with fury. He was going to beat her until there was nothing left. Clara closed her eyes, bracing for the agony, utterly crushed, waiting for the end. Julian raised the heavy leather belt high above his head. The brass buckle glinted under the harsh morning light. Clara squeezed her eyes shut. She tightened her arms around her fragile stomach, curling herself as tightly as humanly possible against the cold marble floor. She stopped breathing. She waited for the sharp, blinding tear of leather against her skin. She waited for the agony that had defined her existence for 24 months. But the blow never landed. Instead, a sound like a bomb detonating shook the entire penthouse. The heavy, solid oak double doors of the master bedroom did not just open. They exploded off their heavy steel hinges. The concussive force sent a wave of dust and splinters blasting into the room. One of the massive doors crashed onto the expensive Persian rug, cracking the marble tiles beneath it. Julian jumped back. He dropped the belt, his arrogant face instantly draining of all color. Clara gasped, opening her eyes through the haze of floating dust. Time seemed to drag to a terrifying, suspended halt. Stepping through the shattered wreckage of the doorway was a man who looked like he had been carved from the shadows of the city itself. It was Dominic Russo. Dom did not rush into the room. He did not yell. He walked with the slow, terrifying deliberation of an apex predator that had already won the hunt. He wore a sharply tailored black suit that seemed to absorb the light. His dark eyes swept the room in a fraction of a second. He registered the shattered glass in the hallway. He registered Julian standing by the bed. He registered the heavy leather belt discarded on the floor. And finally, his cold, dead calm gaze locked onto Clara. He saw her bleeding lip. He saw her curled into a defensive ball, desperately shielding her stomach. A dangerous, lethal silence filled the room. The air grew incredibly heavy. Dom's jaw ticked. It was the only visible sign of emotion on his stoic, hardened face. He was the most feared syndicate boss in the city. He had tracked Julian down to collect the $5 million debt owed to Silas Thorne. But the debt was no longer the priority. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Julian screamed. His voice cracked with a pathetic mixture of outrage and stark terror. He tried to puff out his chest, attempting to assert his high society dominance in a room he suddenly did not control. "This is private property. I am Julian Sterling. I will have you arrested. I will ruin you." Dom did not blink. He did not utter a single word in response. He simply reached under his tailored suit jacket. The movement was incredibly smooth. He drew a matte black, suppressed 9mm handgun. He did not aim at Julian's chest. He aimed lower. Thwip, thwip, thwip. 3 suppressed shots rang out in rapid, precise succession. The sound was quiet, like heavy staples driving into thick wood. Julian's arrogant screaming stopped instantly. His eyes bulged in absolute shock. He looked down. Dark crimson blood began to bloom rapidly across the perfectly tailored fabric of his expensive trousers. Both of his kneecaps had been entirely shattered. The delay of the nervous system lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Julian collapsed to the floor. A high-pitched, agonizing wail tore from his throat. He writhed on the ruined Persian rug, clutching his shattered legs, sobbing uncontrollably. The billionaire monster was suddenly reduced to a weeping, pathetic heap on the floor. Clara stared in stunned silence. She was trembling so violently her teeth rattled. She pushed herself backward until her spine hit the side of the bed. She didn't know whether she had been saved, or if she was simply watching a new, more terrifying monster take over her nightmare. Julian choked on his own spit, gasping in agony. He pointed a shaking, blood-stained finger at Clara. "She's my wife," he screamed, his voice breaking into a hysterical sob. "You can't take her. She's mine. She is my property." Dom slowly lowered his weapon. He engaged the safety and slid the gun back into his shoulder holster. He walked deliberately across the room. He did not step around Julian. He stepped over him, his polished leather shoes leaving a faint bloody footprint on the floor. He stopped in front of the cowering billionaire. He looked down with an expression of absolute, terrifying disgust. "A human being is not property." "Sterling," Dom said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble. It was ice cold. It was a voice that commanded empires in the dark. "The concept of ownership ends where a woman's right to breathe begins. You don't own a damn thing. Not anymore." Julian sobbed, pressing his face into the rug, the pain finally overcoming his arrogance. Dom turned his back on the bleeding man. He knelt down on the cold marble floor, right in the center of the shattered glass. He was a massive man, imposing and lethal, but as he lowered himself to Clara's eye level, his entire demeanor shifted. The lethal predator vanished. He moved with extreme, calculated caution. He did not reach out to touch her. He knew better. He knew the anatomy of fear. "Look at me," Dom said softly. Clara flinched, but she forced her tear-streaked eyes to meet his. His eyes were dark, carrying the weight of 1,000 violent nights, but there was no cruelty in them. There was only a fierce, protective resolve. "I am not going to hurt you," Dom said. The words were simple, but they carried a heavy, undeniable truth. "My name is Dominic. I am going to take you out of this room, but I will not touch you unless you permit it. Do you understand?" Clara could not speak. Her throat was entirely closed off. She looked at the blood on the floor. She looked at Julian, who was groaning in a pool of his own making. Then she looked back at Dominic. For 2 years, Julian had never asked for permission. He had simply taken. This man, a terrifying mob boss with a gun still smoking in his holster, was waiting for her consent. Clara gave a small, trembling nod. Dom slowly took off his heavy, dark wool suit jacket. It still carried the warmth of his body and a faint scent of cedar and expensive cologne. He leaned forward and gently draped the large jacket over her trembling shoulders. It swallowed her entirely, acting as a heavy, protective shield against the cold air of the penthouse. "Can you walk?" Dom asked quietly. Clara tried to push herself up, but the sharp pain in her shoulder flared violently. Her legs felt like water. She shook her head, tears spilling over her bruised cheeks. She felt so weak, so pathetic. "That's okay," Dom murmured. "I've got you." He slid one strong arm beneath her knees and the other around her back. He lifted her from the floor with effortless ease, cradling her tightly against his chest. Clara gasped at the sudden movement, instinctively burying her face into his crisp white dress shirt. She expected him to smell like blood and violence. Instead, he smelled safe. Dom turned and walked toward the blasted doorway. He did not spare Julian a single backward glance. He carried Clara through the dust, stepping over the shattered oak doors, and walked out into the long, silent hallway of the penthouse. He carried her past the expensive art, past the designer furniture, and out of the velvet cage. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Dawes stepped inside. As the heavy steel doors slid shut, cutting off the sounds of Julian's pathetic whimpering, Clara finally allowed herself to close her eyes. She didn't know where this dark, terrifying man was taking her, but as she listened to the steady, calm rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his shirt, she knew one thing for certain. For the first time in 2 years, she was allowed to breathe. The armored SUV moved through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago like a massive, silent shadow. Inside the cabin, The heavy hum of the engine was the only sound. The windows were tinted pitch black, shutting out the glaring neon lights of the city. Clara sat in the deep leather seat, clutching Dominic Russo's heavy wool coat tightly around her trembling shoulders. Fabric smelled of rain, cedar, and gunpowder. She was still shivering. Her mind was a fractured, chaotic mess, trapped somewhere between the shattered glass of the penthouse and the deafening silence of this vehicle. She kept waiting for the illusion to break. She kept waiting to wake up on the marble floor with Julian's leather belt striking her ribs. Dominic sat on the opposite side of the spacious cabin. He was a massive, imposing figure in the dim light, but he had intentionally positioned himself as far away from her as the space allowed. He did not look at her. He stared out the window, his jaw tight, giving her the immense, unspoken gift of privacy. He was reading her body language perfectly. Every time the SUV hit a minor bump in the road, Clara flinched, pulling her knees closer her chest to protect her stomach. Dom noticed, and he quietly tapped the glass partition, dividing them from the driver. He gave a single, subtle downward motion with his hand. The driver immediately slowed the vehicle, navigating the potholes with painstaking care. They drove for an hour, leaving the glittering skyline of the city behind. The vehicle finally slowed, turning onto a private, winding road bordered by towering pine trees. They approached a massive wrought iron gate. Heavily armed men stood in the pouring rain, their faces obscured by the shadows. The gate swung open silently. The SUV pulled into the courtyard of a sprawling, brutalist stone estate. It did not look like a home. It looked like a fortress. It was the exact opposite of Julian's glass penthouse. There were no fragile windows here. There were only thick stone walls and absolute security. The vehicle stopped. A guard opened the door, but Dominic immediately held up a hand, stopping the man from reaching inside to help Clara. Dom stepped out into the rain first. He turned and offered his hand, keeping his palm open and facing upward. It was an invitation, not a command. Clara looked at his large, scarred hand. She took a shallow breath, ignoring the stabbing pain in her ribs, and carefully slid out of the seat without taking his hand. Dom did not look offended. He simply nodded, stepping back to give her a wide berth. He led her through the heavy mahogany front doors and up a sprawling oak staircase. The house was enormous, but it was incredibly quiet. The staff moved like ghosts, averting their eyes, granting Clara complete anonymity. Dom opened the door to the master suite at the end of the hall. It was a massive room, decorated in warm, dark tones. A fire was already crackling in the stone hearth, casting a golden, flickering glow across the heavy velvet curtains and the wide, meticulously made bed. Clara stepped inside, her bare feet sinking into the thick, plush carpet. She immediately backed into the farthest corner of the room, pressing her spine against the heavy oak wardrobe. It was a deeply ingrained survival instinct. She needed to put a solid wall behind her back. She wrapped her arms tightly around her stomach, her wide, terrified eyes tracking Dom's every movement. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was waiting for the invoice. A man like Dominic Russo did not just shoot a billionaire and rescue a woman for nothing. Dom walked to the heavy wooden door. He closed it. The heavy lock clicked into place with a definitive, absolute sound. Clara stopped breathing, but Dom did not walk toward her. He stood near the door, keeping the entire length of the massive room between them. He slowly reached up and unholstered his weapon. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable violence. But the sound that followed was not the slide of a gun racking a bullet. It was a soft, metallic thud. Clara opened her eyes. Dom had placed the matte black 9mm handgun on the bedside nightstand. He looked at her, his dark, weary eyes completely devoid of malice. "The safety is off," Dominic said. His voice was a low, steady rumble, carefully modulated to avoid echoing in the large room. "There is a round in the chamber. The trigger pull is light. If I step within 3 feet of you without your explicit permission, Clara, you pick up that gun and you shoot me." Clara stared at him, utterly paralyzed. Her mind could not process the gravity of his words. Julian had stripped her of every defense, every sharp object, every ounce of power. This man had just handed her a loaded weapon and the absolute right to end his life if he crossed her boundaries. Dom did not wait for a response. He unbuttoned his vest, took it off, and threw it over a chair. The bathroom is through that door. There are fresh clothes in the drawers. No one will enter this room. No one will knock. You are safe here. He walked to a large leather armchair by the window, on the absolute opposite side of the room. He sat down, crossing his long legs, and looked out at the rain. He made himself entirely non-threatening. He became a piece of the furniture. Clara stood in the corner for a very long time. Her breathing was shallow, rapid, and erratic, as a pediatric physical therapist. She understood the precise biological mechanics of her own terror. Her sympathetic nervous system was in overdrive. Her amygdala was screaming that she was in mortal danger. Cortisol and adrenaline were flooding her bloodstream, preparing her muscles to run or fight. But there was nowhere to run, and the man she was supposed to fight had just disarmed himself. She needed to regulate her shattered nervous system. She closed her eyes. She forced herself to focus on the anatomy of her breath. She inhaled slowly through her nose, counting to 4. Feeling the cool air hit the back of her throat, she held it for 4 seconds. She exhaled through her mouth for 6 seconds. The prolonged exhale stimulated her vagus nerve, sending a desperate biological signal to her brain that the immediate threat had passed. She opened her eyes and began a visual grounding exercise. She forced her brain to identify objects in the room. 5 things she could see: the flickering orange flames in the fireplace, the heavy brass lamp on the desk, the dark green velvet curtains, the silver tray of water on the table, and the black gun on the nightstand. 4 things she could feel: the rough texture of the wool coat on her shoulders, the cold sweat on her palms, the soft carpet beneath her toes, and the deep, dull ache in her bruised ribs. Slowly, agonizingly, the violent trembling in her hands began to subside. The immediate panic attack receded, leaving behind a profound, bone-crushing exhaustion. She moved cautiously across the room, keeping her eyes fixed on Dom. He did not move. He did not even turn his head. She reached the bathroom, stepped inside, and locked the door. When she stripped off her ruined clothes and looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Her lip was split and swollen. A dark, ugly purple bruise was blooming across her left cheekbone. Fingerprint bruises marked her throat in a violent necklace of pain. But as she placed a gentle, shaking hand over her flat stomach, a fierce, undeniable wave of maternal instinct washed over her. She had survived. Her baby had survived. When she finally emerged from the bathroom an hour later, wearing an oversized, soft cotton shirt and sweatpants she found in the drawers, the room was dimly lit. Dom was still sitting in the exact same chair. He had not moved an inch. On the small table near the bed, a tray of hot soup, fresh bread, and tea had magically appeared. "Eat," Dom said softly, without looking away from the window. "You need your strength." Clara sat on the edge of the massive bed. The loaded gun was less than a foot from her hand. She ate in silence, the warm broth soothing her raw throat. The silence stretched between them for hours. It was not the oppressive, terrifying silence of Julian's penthouse. It was a spacious, breathing silence. It demanded nothing of her. As the rain lashed against the thick reinforced glass, Clara finally found her voice. It was raspy, broken, and quiet. "Why did you do it?" she asked. "Why did you save me?" Dom remained silent for a long time. The shadows from the fireplace danced across his scarred, hardened face. He did not look at her when he finally spoke. His voice was heavy with the weight of ancient ghosts. "When I was 9 years old, I lived in a house twice this size," Dom said slowly. "It was filled with expensive things and very quiet servants. My father was the head of the syndicate before me. He was a powerful man. He commanded fear. But he was also a coward." Dom paused. Claris's massive hands gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white. "He drank," Dom continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, strained whisper, and when he drank, he used his fists. My mother, Bianca, was the most beautiful, gentle woman in the world. She wore silk scarves to hide the bruises on her neck. I used to hide at the top of the stairs and listen to the sounds of things breaking in the parlor. I listened to her crying. I listened to him hitting her, and I did nothing, because I was a terrified child. He finally turned his head and looked directly at Clara. His dark eyes were swimming in a sea of unresolved, violent grief. One night, the crying stopped, Dom said. The words fell like heavy stones onto the floor. He beat her to death. The police were paid off. The medical examiner wrote, "Accidental fall down the stairs" on the death certificate. He buried her in a closed casket, and he never spent a single second in a jail cell. I inherited his empire, his money, and his blood. But I made a vow over her grave. I implemented one absolute, unbreakable rule in my territory. He pointed a steady finger toward the door. No man lays his hand on a woman, ever. Not a husband. Not a debt collector. Not a king. When I walked into that penthouse and saw that bastard raise a belt to you, I didn't see Julian Sterling. I saw my father. And I didn't save you, Clara. I saved the woman I couldn't save when I was 9 years old. Clara stared at him. The terrifying mafia boss dissolved before her eyes, leaving only a profoundly broken man carrying the immense weight of a childhood tragedy. She understood trauma. She understood the deep, psychological scars that shaped a person's entire existence. I don't buy people, Dom added, his voice returning to its normal, steady cadence. I didn't take you as a prize. You are not a prisoner here. When you are healed, when you are ready, you can walk out that front door and never look back. I will give you a new identity, money, and protection. Until then, this house is your sanctuary, and no one will ever hurt you again. Clara pulled the heavy duvet over her shoulders. She looked at the gun on the nightstand. For the first time in 2 years, she did not feel the crushing, suffocating weight of ownership. Dominic Russo had not just saved her life. He had handed her back the keys to her own autonomy. She closed her eyes, listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the dangerous man sitting across the room, guarding her sleep. The Greyhound bus ticket to Columbus, Ohio burned a hole in Clara's pocket like a hot coal. She sat on the edge of the large bed in the master suite, staring at the small, cheap piece of paper. It had been 4 weeks since Dominic had smashed through the doors of her personal hell. 4 weeks of absolute, unwavering respect. In the sanctuary of the stone fortress, Clara's physical bruises had faded from ugly purple to a dull, pale yellow. Her split lip had healed, but the psychological wounds were far deeper, and they demanded a different kind of medicine. Dominic was a man of his word. He never crossed the invisible boundaries of the room without her explicit consent. He asked permission to open the curtains. He asked permission to sit at the table with her during meals. He systematically restored her agency, proving through quiet, consistent actions that true care was rooted in consent, not coercive control. But as Clara's mind cleared, a stark, terrifying realization settled into her bones. Dominic Russo was a good man to her, but he was still a king in a world built on blood and violence. To stay in his fortress meant trading a cruel warden for a kind one. It meant surviving under the shadow of his immense power. Clara did not want to be a protected pet. She did not want to rely on the guns and the wealth of any man to keep her safe. She needed to know that she could survive on her own. She needed absolute, terrifying independence. She had to run, not just from the monster who beat her, but from the mafia boss who saved her. She had planned her escape meticulously, utilizing the precise, analytical skills she had honed as a physical therapist. She mapped out the patrol routes of Dominic's armed guards from her bedroom window. She noted the 15-second blind spot during the shift change at the eastern gate. She had slowly stockpiled cash, taking small bills from the wallet Dom had left on the dresser for her personal use, making sure the amounts were too insignificant to trigger suspicion. At exactly 2:15 a.m., while the heavy rain masked the sound of her footsteps, Clara slipped out of the master suite, She wore a dark hoodie, a pair of worn sneakers, and carried nothing but a small backpack. She navigated the dark corridors of the massive estate like a ghost. She reached the eastern perimeter wall right as the guards swapped positions. She squeezed through a narrow gap in the wrought iron fencing, the cold rain soaking her to the bone. She ran for 2 miles through the dense woods until she reached the highway. She hitched a ride with an elderly truck driver who asked no questions. By dawn, she was sitting in a crowded, dirty bus terminal in a neighboring state, clutching her ticket to Ohio. As the Greyhound bus pulled out of the station, heading east down the interstate, Clara looked out the smeared window. The sprawling, dangerous skyline of Chicago faded into the distance. She placed a hand over her slightly rounded stomach. She was alone. She was terrified. But for the first time in her life, she was entirely free. The metaphorical ankle monitor Julian had shackled to her soul had finally fallen off. 3 days later, Clara walked through the peeling front doors of the Safe Haven Women's Shelter on the outskirts of Columbus. It was a modest, run-down brick building, but, to Clara, it looked like a palace. She used a fake name. She told them she was running from an abusive boyfriend. The shelter director, a woman named Martha, welcomed her with open arms. Martha was a plump, silver-haired woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a warm, maternal smile. She poured Clara a cup of hot tea and held her trembling hands. "You're safe now, sweetheart," Martha had said, her voice dripping with practiced empathy. "He can't find you here. The system protects women like us." Clara believed her. She wanted to believe her with every fiber of her being. The next 2 months were a grueling, exhausting, beautiful struggle. With Martha's help, Clara secured a tiny, one-bedroom apartment in a quiet, working-class neighborhood. The paint was peeling, the radiator hissed constantly, and the mattress was lumpy. But it was hers. She found a low-paying, cash-under-the-table job organizing inventory in the back room of a dusty, independent bookstore. She didn't mind the dust or the long hours. Every dollar she earned was a brick in the foundation of her new, independent life. She began to smile again. She bought cheap, vibrant yarn and spent her evenings knitting a small yellow blanket. She practiced prenatal yoga on her worn living room rug, breathing deeply, reconnecting with the body Julian had tried to destroy. The true milestone of her freedom came during her 16th week. Martha arranged a confidential appointment for Clara at a free women's medical clinic on the other side of the city. Clara lay on the crinkling paper of the examination table, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and anticipation. The elderly doctor applied the cold gel to her stomach and pressed the ultrasound wand against her skin. For a terrifying moment, there was only static. Then suddenly, the small, cramped room was filled with a sound. It was rapid, urgent, and incredibly strong. Thump, 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 thump. It sounded like a tiny, galloping horse racing across a vast plain. Clara burst into tears. She covered her mouth, sobbing uncontrollably. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard in her entire life. It was the sound of defiance. It was a life that Julian Sterling had tried to crush, a life that had survived the beatings, the terror, and the long, desperate run in the dark. "Heart rate is strong and steady," the doctor smiled, wiping the gel away. "You have a fighter in there." "Mom." Clara walked out of the clinic that afternoon feeling invincible. The crisp autumn air filled her lungs. The golden leaves fell around her like confetti. She stopped at a small grocery store on the corner of her street. She bought fresh vegetables, a carton of milk, and a single, perfect red apple to celebrate. She carried the brown paper bag in her arms, humming a quiet tune she remembered from her childhood. She reached her apartment building. She climbed the 3 flights of narrow, creaking stairs. She was tired, but her heart was soaring. She reached her door, balancing the groceries on her hip, and dug into her pocket for her keys. She inserted the key into the lock. It didn't turn. The door was already unlocked. Clara froze. The breath evaporated from her lungs. A cold, paralyzing dread instantly flooded her veins. freezing her blood. The psychological alarms in her brain began to scream. She had explicitly locked the deadbolt this morning. She always checked it twice. It was a habit born of absolute paranoia. Her hand trembled violently as she slowly pushed the wooden door open. The apartment was dark. The curtains were drawn, blocking out the afternoon sun. Then she smelled it. It was a subtle, expensive scent: bergamot, aged leather, and a hint of dark whiskey. It was a bespoke cologne that cost $3,000 a bottle. It was a scent that did not belong in a rundown apartment building in Ohio. It was a scent that had haunted her nightmares for 2 years. You really thought Ohio was far enough, Clara. The voice came from the shadows of the living room. It was smooth, arrogant, and dripping with malicious amusement. Clara dropped the paper bag. The groceries crashed onto the cheap linoleum floor. The red apple rolled across the room, stopping at the edge of the faded rug, sitting on her cheap, second-hand sofa. His long legs crossed casually, was Julian Sterling. He was wearing an immaculate charcoal suit. His shattered knees had been surgically repaired, though a silver-tipped cane rested against the armrest of the sofa. He looked perfectly healthy. He looked terrifyingly calm. Sitting in the armchair directly across from him was Martha, the kind, maternal shelter director, was calmly sipping a cup of Clara's tea. Martha did not look at Clara. She simply stared down at her lap, nervously twisting a thick envelope of cash in her hands. "Martha," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. The betrayal was a physical blow, sharper than any fist. Julian chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He picked up the yellow knitted baby blanket from the coffee table, inspecting the stitches with mock fascination. "The system protects women, Clara," Julian sneered, repeating Martha's exact words. He tossed the yellow blanket onto the floor and stepped on it with his polished leather shoe. "But the system is run by people, and people have mortgages. People have debts. $100,000 can buy a lot of empathy in this world." Clara backed toward the open door, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She had to run. She turned, adrenaline flooding her system. But as she spun around, the doorway was immediately blocked. Two massive, broad-shouldered men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows of the stairwell, effectively sealing her inside. They were Silas Thorne's men. Julian had brought the syndicate with him. The illusion of freedom shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The safety, the quiet life, the heartbeat on the ultrasound, it had all been a temporary, cruel joke. She hadn't escaped the velvet cage. Julian had simply let her wander to the end of a very long, very expensive leash. Julian slowly stood up, leaning heavily on his silver cane. He walked across the small room, his eyes entirely devoid of humanity. He stopped inches from Clara's face. He reached out and gently, terrifyingly, tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Pack your bags, darling," Julian whispered, his breath hot against her cheek. "The vacation is over. It's time to go home. Smile for the cameras, darling," Julian whispered, his fingers digging like iron claws into the delicate curve of Clara's spine. "Or I will make absolutely sure the state authorities take that baby the very second it draws its first breath." The journey from the dilapidated apartment in Ohio back to the suffocating opulence of Chicago had been a masterclass in psychological torture. Julian had not dragged her kicking and screaming. He did not need to. The presence of Silas Thorne's two massive, silent enforcers standing in her cheap living room had been enough to drain every ounce of resistance from her bones. They had escorted her to a private airfield, ushering her into the sleek, soundproof cabin of a Gulfstream jet. During the flight, Julian had been terrifyingly attentive. He had poured her sparkling water. He had offered her a cashmere blanket. He had spoken to her in the soft, modulated tones of a loving husband, all while detailing the precise, mathematical destruction he would rain down upon her if she ever attempted to embarrass him again. He had explained that her little escape had cost him a significant amount of political capital. The media had begun to ask questions about his sudden, reclusive lifestyle. His investors were getting nervous about the rumors of his financial instability. Silas Thorne, The apex predator, holding Julian's $5 million debt, demanded collateral. And Julian had offered the only asset he had left that held any true, unblemished value: his public image as the perfect, untouchable family man. Now, 3 days after her capture, Clara stood in the center of the penthouse bedroom, staring at her reflection in the gilded mirror. The bruises on her face had been masterfully concealed by a team of high-end makeup artists who had been paid an exorbitant sum to ask zero questions. Her hair was swept up into an elegant, complex chignon, secured with diamond pins that felt like heavy nails driving into her scalp. She was poured into a breathtaking, custom-made gown of ivory silk. The fabric cascaded over her figure, clinging softly to the undeniable, beautiful swell of her 5-month pregnancy. She looked like an angel. She looked like a glowing, radiant, perfectly content high society wife. She looked completely, utterly dead inside. The ivory silk felt like a shroud. It was a grotesque, deliberate echo of the white dress she had worn on the yacht the night she was auctioned off to the highest bidder. Julian never missed an opportunity for symbolic cruelty. The penthouse itself had transformed. It was no longer just a gilded cage. It was a military occupation. Silas Thorne's men were everywhere. They stood by the elevators, their tailored suits bulging with concealed weaponry. They monitored the security feeds in Julian's study. They were the silent, looming promise of violence, ensuring that Clara could not so much as walk to the bathroom without being tracked. Julian had consolidated his power by merging his public wealth with Thorne's underworld muscle. He had sold his soul to keep his empire, and Clara was the shiny, heavily guarded hood ornament of their new, unholy alliance. Julian stepped up behind her reflection in the mirror. He was dressed in a flawless midnight blue tuxedo. He placed his hands on her bare shoulders. Clara's nervous system screamed, her vagus nerve sending frantic signals of distress throughout her body. But she forced her muscles to remain perfectly still. She had learned the hard way that flinching only provoked him. He leaned down, burying his face in the curve of her neck, inhaling deeply. "You look extraordinary," he murmured, his breath hot against her skin. "Tonight is the apex of my career." Clara, 300 of the wealthiest, most influential people in the state, are waiting in the ballroom of the Drake Hotel. Senators, judges, tech billionaires. They are all coming to donate to my new philanthropic foundation. They are coming to see my beautiful, pregnant wife. You are going to be charming. You are going to be radiant. You are going to hold my hand and look at me as if I hung the moon and the stars. Because if I see even a shadow of defiance in your eyes, if you so much as whisper a word of your pathetic delusions to anyone in that room, I will not wait until the baby is born. I will have Thorne's men cut it out of you in a sterile basement, and you will spend the rest of your natural life heavily medicated in a private psychiatric facility owned by my holding company. Do you understand the assignment, my love?" Clara looked at his handsome, soulless face in the mirror. The maternal instinct that had once brought her so much joy in Ohio now felt like a terrifying vulnerability. She was a hostage, and her unborn child was the gun pressed directly to her head. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat. "I understand," she whispered. The ballroom of the Drake Hotel was a cathedral of blinding light and deafening noise. The moment Julian's armored limousine pulled up to the red carpet, the flashbulbs erupted like a violent electrical storm. Clara was instantly blinded, her vision reduced to exploding spots of white light. Julian gripped her arm, his fingers finding the exact pressure points between her muscles to inflict a sharp, agonizing pain that would never show up on camera. He guided her up the steps, smiling broadly, waving to the press, playing the role of the triumphant titan of industry. The reporters screamed their questions, their voices a cacophonous roar. "Julian, how does it feel to be expecting your first child?" "Clara, you look stunning. Who designed the gown?" Clara forced her lips to stretch into a wide, vacuous smile. She nodded. She played the part. She was a ghost haunting her own body. Inside, the ballroom was a masterpiece of floral arrangements, crystal chandeliers, and flowing champagne. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and the arrogant, loud laughter of the untouchable elite. Julian paraded her through the room like a prized racehorse. He introduced her to a federal judge who complimented her glow. He introduced her to a media mogul who offered to host their baby shower. These were the architects of society, the people who were supposed to uphold justice and truth. And none of them saw the terror screaming behind Clara's painted eyes. None of them noticed the way her fingers trembled around her crystal water goblet. They only saw the illusion. Clara realized with a crushing, suffocating despair that the system was not broken. It was operating exactly as it was designed. It protected power, and it consumed the weak. 2 hours into the gala, the psychological strain became unbearable. The noise, the heat, the constant, excruciating performance was draining the life from her. Julian was engaged in a deep, hushed conversation with Silas Thorne in a VIP alcove near the grand staircase. Thorne was an older, terrifyingly calm man with dead eyes and a tailored suit that cost more than a small house. Julian had temporarily released Clara's arm to shake Thorne's hand, though he kept her position slightly behind him, effectively blocking her only path of escape. A young waiter in a crisp white uniform approached their alcove, carrying a silver tray of fresh champagne flutes. He moved with a strange, fluid grace, keeping his head bowed respectfully. As he stepped past Clara to offer a glass to Julian, he stumbled, just a fraction of an inch. His shoulder brushed heavily against Clara's arm. "My deepest apologies, madam," the waiter murmured quickly, his voice entirely devoid of the usual high society obsequiousness. It was a rough, gritty voice, a voice from the streets. Before Julian could turn around to reprimand the man, the waiter had already bowed and vanished into the swirling crowd. Clara stood perfectly still. Her heart had stopped beating. In the brief, chaotic moment of the collision, the waiter had slipped a small, folded cocktail napkin directly into the palm of her hand. Her fingers clamped down on it instantly, hiding it within the folds of her voluminous ivory silk skirt. Her pulse began to roar in her ears. She waited until Julian turned back to Silas Thorne, engaging in a debate about offshore zoning permits. Clara took a slow, agonizing step backward, retreating into the heavy shadows of a marble pillar. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the small, square napkin. There were only 10 words written on the paper, scrawled in hasty, jagged black ink. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was the bold, sharp script of a man who commanded empires. "Keep breathing. I'm burning the city down to find you." A physical shockwave tore through Clara's body. The air rushed back into her lungs in a desperate, ragged gasp. Dominic, he was alive. He was looking for her. The numbness that had paralyzed her soul for 3 days shattered instantly. Hope, sharp and agonizing as a newly set bone, pierced through her despair. She looked up, her eyes scanning the massive, crowded ballroom, desperately searching for a glimpse of his broad shoulders, a flash of his dark eyes. But there was only the sea of wealthy guests, completely oblivious to the war that was about to erupt in their midst. The first indication that the world was ending was the sudden, total blackout of the ballroom. The massive crystal chandeliers, glowing with the power of 10,000 bulbs, died instantly. The music cut off with a sickening screech of feedback from the speakers. The ballroom plunged into an abyss of absolute, terrifying darkness. For 3 seconds, there was total silence. The elite guests were too stunned, too insulated by their wealth to immediately process the threat. Then the screaming began. It was followed immediately by the deafening, concussive roar of automatic gunfire. The massive, domed glass ceiling of the Drake Hotel ballroom shattered inward. Thousands of shards of thick, jagged glass rained down upon the screaming crowd like a glittering, lethal hailstorm. Ropes dropped from the broken skylights, and heavily armed men dressed in tactical black gear descended into the chaos. Dominic's extraction team had arrived. Panic consumed the room. The wealthiest people in Chicago trampled each other, diving under tables, slipping on the slick, blood-spattered marble floor. Clara was thrown backward by the sheer force of the surging crowd. She fell against the marble pillar, wrapping her arms protectively around her stomach, curling into a tight ball as the glass rained down around her. The darkness was illuminated only by the frantic, stroboscopic muzzle flashes of the tactical rifles. The deafening roar of the gunfire echoed off the high walls, a chaotic symphony of violence. Clara, the voice cut through the madness like a physical blade. It was a roar of pure, unfiltered desperation. Clara opened her eyes. Standing 10 feet away, illuminated by the erratic flashes of gunfire, was Dominic Russo. He was not wearing a tailored suit. He was wearing tactical armor, his face covered in soot and sweat, a heavy assault rifle strapped to his chest. He looked like a god of war. He locked eyes with her, and the terrifying, lethal coldness in his gaze vanished, replaced by an overwhelming surge of relief. He began to run toward her, pushing through the screaming crowd, his massive frame easily clearing a path. "Dom," Clara screamed, pushing herself off the floor, reaching out toward him. But as Dominic closed the distance, the shadows behind the alcove moved. Julian had not panicked when the lights went out. Julian had not dived under a table. Julian had known this was coming. He had baited the trap. Silas Thorne's elite security forces had been waiting in the service corridors, heavily armed and wearing night vision optics. They flooded the ballroom from the flanks, ambushing Dominic's extraction team in a perfectly coordinated crossfire. As Dom reached within 3 feet of Clara, his hand outstretched to pull her into his chest, a blinding spotlight snapped on from the balcony above, pinning him in a circle of harsh, inescapable white light. Julian stepped out from behind a marble column, perfectly calm, untouched by the chaos. He raised a heavy, modified Magnum revolver, aiming it directly at Clara's pregnant stomach. "Checkmate, Russo," Julian yelled over the din of the gunfire. "Drop the weapon, or I paint this pillar with her." Dominic froze. His tactical training, his survival instinct, his empire, none of it mattered. He looked at the gun pointed at Clara's stomach, and without a single second of hesitation, he threw his assault rifle to the marble floor. He raised his hands, stepping deliberately in front of Clara, using his massive, armored body as a human shield between her and Julian. "You want me," Sterling, Dom growled, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, primal fury. "You have me. Let her walk." Julian's lips curled into a grotesque, triumphant smile. "I don't make deals with dead men." Julian shifted his aim from Clara to Dominic's unprotected face. But before he could pull the trigger, Silas Thorne's men opened fire from the balcony. The impact of the high-caliber rounds hitting Dominic's body armor sounded like a sledgehammer striking concrete. The kinetic force lifted the massive mafia boss off his feet. He was thrown backward, crashing through the heavy, ornate glass doors that led to the outdoor terrace overlooking the freezing, churning waters of the Chicago River. "No," Clara's scream tore her throat raw. It was a sound of absolute, soul-shattering agony. She lunged forward, grasping blindly for him. But her fingers only caught the empty, blood-spattered air. Dominic's body crashed over the low stone balustrade of the terrace. He did not cry out. His dark eyes remained locked on Clara's for one agonizing, eternal second as he fell backward into the darkness, swallowed completely by the freezing, black abyss of the river 50 feet below. The spotlight snapped off. The gunfire abruptly ceased. The ballroom descended into a terrifying, suffocating silence, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded guests. Clara collapsed onto her knees on the cold, glass-covered marble. Her hands were covered in Dominic's blood, smeared from the shattered terrace doors. Her mind fractured. The sanctuary was gone. The ghost was dead. She was entirely, profoundly alone in the dark. The silence that followed the slaughter was a heavy, suffocating blanket that smelled of cordite, expensive perfume, and fresh blood. Clara remained on her knees by the shattered terrace doors, her hands pressed against the cold, jagged remnants of the glass. The freezing wind whipping off the Chicago River tore through her thin ivory silk dress, but she could not feel the cold. She could not feel anything. Her brain had triggered a massive dissociative response, short-circuiting her sensory input to protect her from the absolute. crushing reality of what she had just witnessed. Dominic was gone. The man who had disarmed himself to make her feel safe. The man who had rebuilt her shattered dignity. The man who had burned down a ballroom to find her had been thrown into the freezing abyss. Her chest heaved with dry, agonizing sobs that produced no tears. She was entirely hollowed out. Footsteps crunched slowly over the broken glass. They were measured, calm and utterly unhurried. Julian Sterling walked out onto the terrace. His midnight blue tuxedo was immaculately clean, save for a few specks of dust on the lapels. He looked down at the dark, churning water of the river, then looked down at Clara kneeling in the blood. He did not look like a man who had just survived a massive tactical assault. He looked like a director admiring the final act of a beautifully orchestrated tragedy, a tragic loss. Julian murmured, his voice smooth and conversational. He reached down and firmly grasped Clara's upper arm, hauling her to her feet with brutal, effortless strength. Clara's legs buckled, but he held her upright, his fingers digging into her bruised flesh. But a necessary one, you see, Clara. The problem with heroes is that they are entirely predictable. Russo's obsession with your safety was a glaring tactical vulnerability. I knew he would come for you. I simply provided the stage. Clara stared at him, her vision swimming. You killed him, she whispered, her voice a hollow, ragged rasp. You killed him. No, darling. Julian smiled, a terrifying, shark-like baring of teeth. You killed him, and you are going to pay for it. Before Clara could comprehend the sheer magnitude of his threat, Julian began to move with terrifying speed and precision. The chaos in the ballroom behind them was subsiding as Sizethorn's men systematically cleared the floor, ensuring the wealthy guests remained pinned and terrified. Julian dragged Clara back into the ruined ballroom. He walked over to the bodies of Dominic's fallen tactical team. With clinical detachment, Julian reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo and produced a thick, blood-stained manila envelope. Inside the envelope were highly detailed, forged financial documents, bank transfers, encrypted emails, and contracts bearing Clara's forged signature, explicitly authorizing a multi-million-dollar payout from her own private accounts to the Russo syndicate for the assassination of her husband. Julian knelt beside the body of Dom's point man and carefully slipped the envelope into the dead man's tactical vest. What are you doing? Clara choked out, the horror finally breaking through her dissociation. Julian stood up, straightening his cuffs. I am establishing the narrative. My love, the media loves a tragedy, but they worship a scandal. The story of a brave, philanthropic billionaire surviving a terrorist attack is good, but the story of a brave, philanthropic billionaires surviving a terrorist attack orchestrated by his own treacherous, money-hungry, pregnant wife, that is legendary. That is the kind of story that buys absolute immunity. The distant, wailing siren of police cruisers finally pierced the night air. It was a massive, coordinated response. Dozens of sirens converging on the Drake Hotel. Julian turned to one of Thorne's mercenaries. Bring in the chief, he ordered sharply. Within minutes, the ballroom was swarming with heavily armed SWAT officers. But they did not secure the perimeter. They did not aim their weapons at Silas Thorne's men. They marched directly toward Julian, lowering their rifles in a posture of complete subservience. Leading the tactical unit was Police Chief Harrison, a heavy-set man with sweat beading on his forehead and the undeniable stench of corruption radiating from his uniform. Harrison had been on Julian and Thorne's payroll for a decade. Julian immediately collapsed onto the floor, pulling Clara down with him. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face in her stomach, and began to sob hysterically. It was a performance of terrifying, Oscar-worthy perfection. Chief, thank God you're here, Julian wailed, his voice cracking with simulated terror and heartbreak. They tried to kill me. The Russo syndicate. They breached the ceiling. They opened fire on the crowd. But it wasn't just a hit. God, Harrison. Tell me it isn't true. Chief Harrison stepped forward, his face a mask of grim authority. He signaled his men. Secure the area. Check the bodies for intel. A SWAT officer walked directly to the body Julian had planted the envelope on. He reached into the vest, pulled out the blood-stained manila folder, and handed it to the chief. Harrison opened it, scanning the forged documents with practiced theatricality. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Clara with a mixture of disgust and cold, bureaucratic triumph. "Mr. Sterling," Chief Harrison said loudly, ensuring his voice carried to the surviving high society guests, cowering behind the overturned tables. "I am incredibly sorry. These documents confirm the wire transfers. Your wife, Clara Sterling, authorized the payment to the Russo syndicate. She hired them to assassinate you tonight." A collective, horrified gasp echoed through the ruined ballroom. The whispers began instantly, vicious and condemning. "The Black Widow. She tried to kill him for the insurance money. She used her pregnancy as a cover." The elite, arrogant crowd, desperate for a scapegoat to explain their terror, swallowed the narrative whole. "No," Clara screamed, struggling violently against Julian's iron grip. "He's lying. He set this up. He owed them money. He's a monster. Please, someone listen to me." Julian held her tighter, crying louder, playing the devastated husband forced to restrain his murderous wife. "Clara, how could you?" he sobbed. "I gave you everything. I loved you. Our baby. How could you do this to our family? Get her off him." Chief Harrison ordered. Two massive SWAT officers lunged forward. They ripped Clara out of Julian's arms with brutal, unnecessary force. They slammed her face first onto the cold, glass-covered marble floor. The impact knocked the wind out of her lungs. She gasped, desperately trying to curl her body to protect her stomach as the heavy weight of the officers pressed a knee into her spine. The cold steel of handcuffs bit viciously into her wrists, ratcheted so tightly they instantly cut off her circulation. "Stop, please. I'm pregnant. You're hurting the baby," Clara begged, her voice tearing as tears of absolute despair finally flooded her eyes. "You should have thought about the baby before you hired a hit squad, you sick bitch," one of the officers hissed in her ear, hauling her roughly to her feet. They dragged her through the ballroom. The surviving guests stared at her with open hatred, spitting curses as she passed. Clara looked back, her vision blurred with tears, and saw Julian standing amidst the wreckage. He had dropped the weeping facade. He stood perfectly straight, his hands in his pockets, watching her with a cold, triumphant smirk. He had won. He had destroyed her completely. The officers dragged her out of the hotel and onto the street. The scene outside was apocalyptic. Hundreds of police cruisers, ambulances, and tactical vehicles blocked the avenue, behind the police barricades. A massive swarm of media vans had descended. The moment Clara was dragged through the doors, the paparazzi erupted. The blinding flashbulbs turned the night into a terrifying, stroboscopic nightmare. Reporters shoved microphones over the barricades, screaming accusations. "Clara, did you plan the massacre? Clara, were you sleeping with Dominic Russo? Clara, how much was the life insurance policy?" She was shoved violently into the back of a heavily armored police transport van. The heavy steel doors slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. The sirens wailed, and the transport lurched forward, carrying her away from the ruins of her life. The booking process at the maximum security federal detention center was a systematic stripping of her humanity. Clara was not treated as a victim, a pregnant woman, or a citizen with rights. She was treated as a high-profile, domestic terrorist. She was stripped of her bloody, torn ivory silk gown. She was forced to stand shivering under harsh fluorescent lights while female guards conducted a brutal, humiliating cavity search. She begged for a doctor. She pleaded for an ultrasound to ensure her baby was safe after the violent arrest. The guards ignored her completely, their faces stony and contemptuous. They threw a rough, scratchy orange jumpsuit at her, completely inadequate for the cold temperatures of the facility. She was not placed in a standard holding cell. Chief Harrison had personally overseen her processing. She was classified as a high-risk, violent offender and transferred deep into the bowels of the prison. into the solitary confinement wing. The guards marched her down a long, freezing concrete corridor. The only sound was the heavy, echoing thud of their combat boots and the rattling of her waist chains. They stopped in front of a heavy steel door with a small, reinforced glass viewing slit. The guard unlocked the door, shoved Clara inside, and slammed it shut. The heavy deadbolts engaged with a sound like a crypt sealing shut. Clara stumbled and fell onto the cold concrete floor. The isolation cell was a nightmare of sensory deprivation. It was 6 feet by 8 feet. There were no windows. The walls were featureless, gray concrete. The only furniture was a solid steel slab attached to the wall, serving as a bed, with a paper-thin mattress that smelled of bleach and despair. A single caged fluorescent bulb in the ceiling emitted a harsh, buzzing white light that would never be turned off. The air was freezing, blasting from a vent near the ceiling, designed to keep inmates compliant and shivering. Clara crawled into the corner of the cell, pulling her knees to her chest, wrapping her chained hands around her stomach. The physical pain of her bruised ribs, her cut face, and the agonizing ache in her lower back was nothing compared to the psychological devastation. She had tried to run, and it had cost Dominic his life. She had tried to fight, and Julian had manipulated the entire justice system to turn her into a monster. The world outside this concrete box believed she was a murderous, greedy psychopath. Julian Sterling owned the police. He owned the media. He owned the narrative. The prison doctor arrived 3 hours later. He did not bring a stethoscope or a blood pressure cuff. He was a tall, skeletal man with cold eyes, escorted by 2 heavily armed guards. He stood outside the cell, speaking through the narrow steel grate in the door. "Inmate Sterling," the doctor said, his voice flat and robotic. "I have been instructed to inform you of your medical status. Your vital signs were recorded during booking. You are stable. The fetus is stable." Clara dragged herself across the floor, pressing her face against the cold steel grate. "Please," she croaked, her voice completely destroyed. "I need to see a real doctor. I need to call a lawyer. I haven't done anything. Please, you have to help me." The doctor leaned in close to the grate. His professional, robotic facade dropped, replaced by a sneer of absolute malice. When he spoke again, his voice was a barely audible, venomous whisper intended only for her ears. "Julian sends his regards." "Clara," the doctor breathed. "He wanted me to deliver a message. He wants you to know that he is ensuring your trial is expedited. You are facing 3 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole. But he is a merciful man. The moment that baby takes its first breath in the prison ward, he has the custody papers already signed by a federal judge. He will take the child. He will raise it in the penthouse. And you will rot in this concrete box until the day you die, completely forgotten by the world." The doctor stepped back, signaling the guards. They turned and walked down the corridor, their footsteps fading into the deafening silence of the solitary wing. Clara slid down the heavy steel door, collapsing onto the freezing concrete. The last, fragile tether holding her sanity together finally snapped. The darkness of the cell rushed in, swallowing her whole. She buried her face in her chained hands, and for the first time since the nightmare began, she let out a long, agonizing, unbroken scream that echoed against the concrete walls, a sound of absolute, bottomless despair that no one in the world would ever answer. Time did not exist in the solitary confinement wing of the Federal Detention Center. There were no windows to mark the passing of the sun, and the harsh, buzzing fluorescent light bolted to the ceiling never flickered, never dimmed, and never turned off. Clara lost the concept of days within the first 72 hours. Her entire universe was reduced to a freezing concrete box measuring 6 feet by 8 feet. The heavy steel door was a monolithic barrier sealing her away from the world of the living. The air pumped through the ceiling vent was perpetually frigid, an intentional, calculated cruelty designed to keep the inmates shivering and compliant. Clara spent her endless, waking hours huddled in the corner on the thin, bleach-scented mattress, wearing the scratchy, oversized orange jumpsuit that offered absolutely no protection against the bone-deep cold. She wrapped her arms tightly around her stomach, rocking back and forth, desperate to generate any semblance of warmth for the fragile life growing inside her. Her mind was a shattered, desolate wasteland. The psychological shock of the Gala massacre played on a continuous, agonizing loop behind her eyelids. Every time she closed her eyes, she did not find sleep. She found the blinding flash of the spotlight, the deafening roar of the tactical rifles, and the horrifying image of Dominic Russo falling backward into the freezing abyss of the Chicago River. The man who had shown her the first true kindness she had known in 2 years was dead, and he had died because he had tried to save her. The guilt was a physical weight, a crushing, suffocating pressure pressing down on her chest. She had nothing left. Julian had perfectly executed a masterpiece of systemic manipulation. He had forged the financial documents, bought the police chief, controlled the media narrative, and effectively buried her alive. On what she guessed was the 5th day of her isolation, the heavy deadbolts of her cell door suddenly clanked open. The sound was so violently loud in the stagnant silence that Clara flinched. Pressing herself harder against the concrete wall, 2 female guards entered the cell. They did not speak to her. They hauled her roughly to her feet, ignoring her weak protests, and secured heavy steel shackles around her wrists and a chain around her waist. They marched her out of the solitary wing, down a labyrinth of freezing, echoing corridors, until they reached a secure visitation room. It was a bleak, windowless space divided by a thick pane of bulletproof glass. The guards shoved Clara into the metal chair on the prisoner's side and locked the door behind her. Clara lifted her head, the heavy chains rattling against the steel table. Sitting on the other side of the glass, leaning back in a comfortable leather chair, was Julian Sterling. He looked immaculate. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silk tie. His hair was perfectly styled, and his handsome, arrogant face radiated an aura of absolute, untouchable triumph. He picked up the black telephone receiver on his side of the glass. He gestured with a perfectly manicured finger for Clara to do the same. With trembling, bruised hands, Clara lifted the heavy receiver to her ear. "Hello, my love." Julian's voice purred through the earpiece. It was smooth, rich, and dripping with venomous satisfaction, I must say. Orange is terribly unflattering on you, though. I suppose high fashion is no longer a priority in your current demographic. Clara stared at him, her throat closing up. The sheer, unadulterated evil radiating from him was paralyzing. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice a broken, hollow rasp. "You won. You have your empire. You killed Dominic. Just let me go." Julian chuckled softly, shaking his head as if she had just told a charming, naive joke. "Let you go, Clara, darling. You fundamentally misunderstand the mechanics of consequence. You tried to humiliate me. You tried to run from me. A man in my position cannot allow a precedent of disobedience. Besides, the narrative we've constructed is far too valuable to abandon now. The grieving, betrayed billionaire is a magnificent look for my upcoming philanthropic gala." He leaned forward, pressing his hands flat against the glass, his eyes narrowing into cold, dead slits. "I own the judge presiding over your case. Clara, I own the federal prosecutor. I have provided them with a mountain of perfectly forged evidence detailing your treacherous affair with the late Mr. Russo, and your calculated plot to assassinate me for my life insurance. You are going to be convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, domestic terrorism, and wire fraud. The judge has already assured me that you will receive 3 consecutive life sentences." Clara's breath hitched in her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look at the monster wearing a human face. "But I am not entirely without mercy," Julian continued, his voice dropping to a terrifying, intimate whisper. "The nursery in the penthouse is nearly finished. It is magnificent. White marble, French silk, the finest imported crib. I have retained a team of elite nannies, the very second you go into labor, in the prison infirmary. A team of federal marshals will be waiting. The moment that child is severed from your body, it belongs to me. A federal judge has already drafted the emergency custody order citing your violent, psychotic nature. You will not even be allowed to hold the baby. You will never see my child. And you will spend the rest of your miserable, pathetic life in this concrete box, knowing that you brought this upon yourself. The final tether of Clara's sanity snapped. The threat to her child, the absolute certainty of Julian's systemic power, crushed the last spark of hope in her soul. She dropped the phone. It dangled by its metal cord, swinging against the glass. She slumped forward onto the metal table, weeping with a profound, bottomless despair that tore at her vocal cords. She was completely destroyed. Julian watched her weep for a full minute, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. Then he hung up his receiver, straightened his tie, and walked out of the visitation room, leaving her to drown in the abyss. When the guards returned her to her cell, Clara did not even crawl to the mattress. She collapsed onto the freezing concrete floor, curling into a tight, defensive ball. She was ready to die. The human mind could only endure a finite amount of psychological torture before it simply shut down. And Clara had reached the absolute limit of her endurance. Hours passed, or perhaps days. She lay motionless in the dark. Then, the heavy deadbolts of the cell door engaged once again. Clara did not move. She did not care if they were coming to feed her or beat her. The heavy door swung open. The harsh light from the corridor spilled into the dark cell. But it was not the guards who stepped inside. "Get up, Clara." The voice was female. It was sharp, authoritative, and completely devoid of the usual bureaucratic contempt. Clara slowly lifted her head. Standing in the center of the cell was a woman she had never seen before. She was in her late 40s, wearing an impeccably tailored navy blue pantsuit, carrying a heavy leather briefcase. Her hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and her eyes were fierce, intelligent, and piercing. She looked wildly out of place in the solitary confinement wing, yet she commanded the space with an aura of absolute authority. "My name is Eleanor Briggs," the woman said, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. "I am a senior partner at Briggs & Vance, specializing in federal human rights violations and high-profile domestic abuse litigation. I am your new legal counsel, and I am getting you out of this tomb." Clara stared at her, her mind struggling to process the words. "Julian," Clara croaked, her voice barely audible. "Julian owns everyone. You can't fight him." Eleanor Briggs did not offer a sympathetic smile. She did not kneel to comfort Clara. Instead, she slammed her heavy leather briefcase down onto the steel bed slab with a loud, resounding crack that made Clara jump. "Listen to me very carefully, Clara," Eleanor commanded, her voice ringing with the clarity of a struck bell. "Julian Sterling is a parasite. He is a domestic terrorist who has used his wealth to weaponize the justice system against you. He relies entirely on your panic, your despair, and your silence to maintain his illusion of power. He wants you curled up on this floor. He wants you broken, because a broken woman is easy to convict." Eleanor took a step closer, her fierce eyes locking onto Clara's. "The system is deeply corrupted, yes, but it is still a machine. And every machine has moving parts that can be jammed, dismantled, and destroyed if you know where to strike. You are not a helpless victim in a tragic romance novel. You are the surviving witness to a massive, multi-million-dollar racketeering syndicate. You know about Silas Thorne. You know about the hidden ledger. You know the exact anatomy of Julian's psychological and physical abuse." Clara slowly pushed herself up into a sitting position. The sheer, unapologetic ferocity of Eleanor Briggs was acting like a defibrillator to her dying heart. "I have spent my entire career hunting untouchable men," Eleanor stated, opening her briefcase and pulling out a thick stack of legal documents. "I do not lose, but I cannot fight this war alone. I need my client to stand up. I need you to take your grief, take your terror, and forge it into the sharpest weapon on this earth. Julian Sterling thinks he destroyed you. I need you to prove him wrong with absolute, surgical, intellectual fury. Are you ready to go to war for your life and the life of your child?" Clara looked at the fierce lawyer. She looked at her chained hands. She thought of Dominic, falling into the freezing river. She thought of Julian's smug, arrogant face behind the glass, and deep within the darkest, most broken corner of her soul, a small spark ignited. It was not hope. Hope was too soft. It was rage. Pure, cold, unadulterated rage. Clara grabbed the edge of the steel bed and pulled herself to her feet. Her legs were shaking. Her body was battered, but she stood tall. She looked Eleanor Briggs directly in the eye. "Where do we start?" Clara whispered. The air outside the federal courthouse tasted like victory. But it was a fragile, dangerous kind of triumph. Clara stood at the top of the marble steps, taking her first unhindered breath of natural air in 3 weeks. The heavy, humiliating weight of the GPS ankle monitor clamped around her right leg was a stark reminder that she was not yet entirely free. But she was no longer buried in the concrete tomb. Eleanor Briggs had executed a legal masterclass in the courtroom that morning. She had completely bypassed the corrupt local judge, filing an emergency federal injunction in the appellate courts. Leveraging human rights precedents and citing catastrophic procedural violations regarding Clara's medical neglect during her pregnancy. The federal judge, far beyond the reach of Julian Sterling's immediate payroll, had granted Clara's release on bail pending trial. Below the courthouse steps, a chaotic sea of media vans, reporters, and blinding flashbulbs awaited them. The paparazzi screamed her name, hurling the same vicious accusations of murder and conspiracy. But Clara did not lower her head. She did not curl into a defensive posture. Clad in a simple, borrowed gray suit provided by Eleanor, Clara kept her back perfectly straight, her chin raised, and her eyes focused dead ahead. She walked through the media circus like a queen walking through a storm. Flanked by Eleanor and 2 private security contractors, they reached a sleek, armored black SUV waiting at the curb. Eleanor opened the door and ushered Clara inside, slamming the heavy door shut, instantly silencing the roar of the reporters. The SUV pulled away from the curb, merging into the heavy Chicago traffic. "They are going to trace the ankle monitor," Clara said quietly, her voice calm and analytical. The transition from victim to strategist was settling into her bones. "Julian will know exactly where we are going." "Let him trace it," Eleanor replied, tapping rapidly on a secure tablet. "The location we are heading to is a fortified, off-the-grid warehouse owned by a shell corporation untraceable to my firm. It has a lead-lined interior that will scramble any localized listening devices. We have 72 hours before the preliminary evidentiary hearing. We need to build the counteroffensive." They drove for an hour, navigating through the decaying, industrial outskirts of the city. The SUV finally pulled into a vast, abandoned shipyard. They drove into a massive, rusted corrugated steel warehouse. The heavy metal doors rolled shut behind them, plunging the interior into dim, secure shadows. The space was sparse, illuminated by heavy halogen work lights. A long metal table sat in the center of the room, covered in laptops and tactical communication gear. Clara stepped out of the vehicle. She looked around the empty warehouse, the exhaustion of the day finally beginning to catch up with her. But before Eleanor could begin unloading her legal files, the sound of a heavy, industrial engine echoed from the far end of the warehouse. Another vehicle, a battered, unmarked black SUV, rolled out from the shadows behind a stack of shipping containers. It screeched to a halt exactly 20 yards away. Eleanor's private security contractors immediately drew their weapons, aiming at the approaching vehicle. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. Had Silas Thorne found them already? The driver's side door of the battered SUV opened. The man who stepped out moved slowly, favoring his left leg with a pronounced, heavy limp. He was wearing a dark, heavy wool coat. His left arm was in a rigid sling, and thick white medical bandages were visible beneath the collar of his shirt, wrapping tightly around his neck and chest. A deep, jagged laceration ran down the side of his face, a brutal new scar intersecting the old ones. He looked battered, broken, and physically exhausted. But as he raised his head and locked his dark, piercing eyes on Clara, the entire world stopped spinning. It was Dominic. Clara stopped breathing. The files in Eleanor's hands slipped and hit the concrete floor, but neither of them noticed. Clara stared at the ghost walking toward her, her mind unable to process the impossible reality. She had seen him fall. She had seen the bullets hit his armor. She had seen the freezing river swallow him whole. Dom stopped 10 feet away. He looked at her, his dark eyes sweeping over the borrowed suit, the bruises fading on her face. And finally, resting on the heavy black ankle monitor strapped to her leg, his jaw tightened, a flash of pure, protective fury burning through his exhaustion. "You're alive," Clara whispered. The words were a fragile, trembling prayer. She didn't think. She didn't analyze the threat. She broke into a run. She crossed the distance between them and threw herself into his one good arm. Dom caught her, his massive frame absorbing her impact. He wrapped his right arm tightly around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, burying his face in her hair. He let out a long, ragged exhale, a sound of profound, world-shattering relief. The vest caught the worst of the impact. Dom murmured, his voice a rough, gravelly rasp against her ear. The river was freezing, but the current pulled me south. My loyalists found me washed up near the old docks. I've been in a secure underground clinic for 3 weeks. The second I could walk, I contacted Eleanor. Clara pulled back just enough to look at his scarred, battered face. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but they were tears of absolute joy. "You came back for me, I told you," Dom said softly, reaching up to wipe a tear from her cheek with his rough thumb. "I would burn this city down to find you. I am not leaving you. Not in this lifetime." Eleanor cleared her throat, stepping forward and signaling her security team to stand down. "As beautiful as this reunion is, we are on a violently ticking clock, Mr. Russo. Do you have the package?" Dom's expression hardened. He turned to Eleanor and nodded. He reached into the inner pocket of his heavy wool coat and pulled out a small, encrypted titanium hard drive. He placed it carefully on the metal table before Julian staged the gala massacre. "I had my best digital infiltration team breach his secure servers," Dom explained, his voice returning to its lethal, commanding cadence. "This drive contains the unencrypted, raw data of Julian's hidden ledger. It proves the $5 million debt to Silas Thorne. It contains the audio recordings of Julian bribing Chief Harrison. And most importantly, it contains the metadata proving that the assassination documents planted on my men were forged by Julian's own legal team." Eleanor's eyes widened with predatory excitement. She picked up the titanium drive as if it were the Holy Grail. "This is the silver bullet. This doesn't just exonerate Clara. This annihilates Julian Sterling, Chief Harrison, and implicates Silas Thorne in a massive federal racketeering conspiracy. The local authorities are compromised. But I have a secure meeting arranged with the regional director of the FBI in exactly 1 hour. We hand this drive over, and Julian will be in federal custody by midnight." A wave of overwhelming, euphoric relief washed over Clara. For the first time in 2 years, the nightmare actually had an end date. The monster was going to be caged. Dom turned to Clara. He reached out and gently rested his hand against the side of her face. "It's almost over," he promised softly. "We hand this over, and you are free, truly free." Clara leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, allowing herself a single moment of profound, absolute peace. The sanctuary wasn't a fortress. It was the man standing in front of her. Then the heavy corrugated steel roof of the warehouse groaned violently. The peace shattered in a microsecond. The heavy industrial skylights above them exploded inward. It wasn't the chaotic, noisy breach of a police raid. It was the terrifying, silent precision of elite, untraceable mercenaries. Silas Thorne did not rely on Julian's messy, dramatic tactics. Thorne relied on absolute, overwhelming lethality. 3 flashbang grenades dropped from the shattered skylights, detonating mid-air with blinding, concussive force. Clara was thrown to the ground, her ears ringing with a high-pitched, agonizing whine. Total disorientation consumed the room. Through the blinding smoke and ringing chaos, The heavy metal doors of the warehouse blew open with a shaped charge. Heavily armored mercenaries swarmed the room, moving with terrifying military precision. Eleanor's private security contractors opened fire, but they were immediately cut down by suppressed automatic weapons. "Get down," Dom roared. He threw his massive body over Clara, shielding her with his back as bullets sparked and ricocheted off the concrete floor around them. He drew his weapon with his good hand, firing blindly into the smoke, desperately trying to hold the line. But he was severely injured, operating on pure adrenaline and agonizing pain. A mercenary breached the perimeter, kicking the metal table over. The titanium hard drive clattered across the concrete. Eleanor dove for the drive, her fierce determination overriding her survival instinct. She grabbed the small piece of metal, scrambling backward. But another mercenary stepped out of the smoke, raising a heavy assault rifle, aiming directly at the lawyer's chest. "No," Clara screamed. The mercenary didn't shoot Eleanor. He stepped forward and delivered a brutal, sweeping kick to her ribs, sending the lawyer crashing to the ground. The hard drive slipped from her grasp, sliding across the floor. A second mercenary, wearing a heavy tactical gas mask, walked deliberately toward the hard drive. He did not pick it up. He unclipped a small, cylindrical incendiary grenade from his tactical belt. He pulled the pin and dropped the grenade directly onto the titanium drive. Whoosh! A blinding, intense pillar of white-hot thermite fire erupted on the concrete. The heat was so intense it forced Dom to drag Clara backward. They watched in absolute horror as the titanium casing of the hard drive glowed cherry red, warped, and instantly melted into a puddle of useless, bubbling slag. The silver bullet, the absolute proof of Julian's crimes, was completely destroyed in seconds. The mercenaries did not attempt to kill Clara or Dom. Their objective was surgical, while the thermite burned the evidence to ash. Two massive men grabbed the semi-conscious Eleanor Briggs by her arms. They hauled the fierce lawyer off the floor, dragging her toward the breached doors. "Eleanor," Clara screamed, trying to scramble forward. But Dom held her back, knowing they would be gunned down instantly if they moved into the line of fire. The mercenaries vanished out the heavy steel doors as quickly as they had arrived, dragging the captive lawyer with them into the shadows. The sound of high-powered engines roared to life, tires screeching on the pavement outside as they fled the shipyard. The warehouse fell into a terrifying, smoky silence, broken only by the crackle of the dying thermite fire. Clara knelt on the concrete, staring at the glowing, melted puddle of slag that used to be their salvation. Her breathing was rapid, shallow and laced with absolute terror. The legal shield was gone. Their fiercest advocate had been kidnapped by a syndicate that left no survivors. The ankle monitor on Clara's leg beeped, a mocking reminder that the authorities were closing in. They had survived the raid, but they had lost the war. They were back to square one. But the abyss they were staring into now was darker, deeper, and infinitely more dangerous. Clara did not cry. She did not fall to the floor and surrender to the crushing weight of the despair closing in around them. She stood over the smoking, melted slag of the titanium hard drive, the harsh halogen lights of the warehouse casting long, hollow shadows across her face. The panic that had always defined her relationship with Julian Sterling, the rapid heartbeat, the suffocating fear, the desperate need to appease, was entirely gone. The thermite fire had burned away the last remnants of the terrified victim she used to be. She looked at Dominic, who was leaning heavily against a metal pillar, his face pale from blood loss and exhaustion, his jaw tight with the agony of a failing war. He had given everything to protect her. Now it was her turn. "We don't need the drive," Clara said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. It did not echo in the cavernous warehouse. It cut through the smoke like a surgical scalpel. The drive was just data. Data can be manipulated. Data can be burned. But Julian's ego, his absolute, pathological narcissism, that is a living, breathing flaw. It is a structural vulnerability. And I know exactly how to break it. Dom looked at her, his dark eyes narrowing. "Clara, Eleanor is in the hands of Silas Thorne. Thorne is a butcher. He will torture her to find out what else we have. and then he will kill her. We have no leverage left. If the FBI doesn't have that ledger, they won't move against Julian. They won't need the ledger if Julian hands them a live confession, Clara stated. Turning to the secure communications terminal Eleanor had left behind, she began rapidly typing. Accessing the emergency contact protocols Eleanor had briefed her on during the chaotic drive to the warehouse. Julian is hosting a massive, televised charity gala tonight at the Sterling Tower atrium to publicly announce his philanthropic merger with Thorne's holding companies. It is his victory lap. He invited the governor, the mayor, and every major news network in the Midwest. He wants to stand under the lights and be worshipped. Clara found the encrypted frequency for Eleanor's contact, the regional director of the FBI. She initiated the secure handshake protocol. I am going to that gala. Dom, I am going to walk right through the front doors. Thorne cannot shoot me on live television surrounded by federal judges and the press. The crowd is my shield. I am going to wire myself into this FBI frequency. And I am going to bait Julian into hanging himself in front of the entire world. Dom pushed himself off the pillar, his face hardening with immediate, fierce objection. Absolutely not. It is a suicide mission. Julian is a psychopath, and Thorne's men will be crawling all over that building. I am not letting you walk into the lion's den alone. Clara walked over to him. She did not flinch from the blood or the guns. She reached up and gently placed her hands on either side of his scarred, battered face. You aren't letting me do anything. Dominic, I am choosing this. For 2 years, I survived a monster by studying his every micro-expression, his every insecurity, his every trigger. I am a pediatric physical therapist. I understand how the human nervous system reacts to stress, but I also know how a narcissist reacts to public humiliation. His arrogance is a fragile glass house, and I have the hammer. I need you to do the one thing I cannot do. I need you to go into the shadows of that tower and find Eleanor before Thorne kills her. Let me handle Julian. Dom stared down into her fierce, unyielding eyes. He saw the absolute, terrifying resolve of a mother protecting her unborn child, of a woman reclaiming her sovereignty. He did not see a possession to be guarded. He saw an equal. He saw a queen. He slowly nodded, resting his forehead against hers for a brief, breathless second. 5 minutes. Clara, he whispered, his voice a gravelly vow. You give me 5 minutes to breach the basement levels and secure Eleanor. Do not push him until I give you the signal. 2 hours later. The Sterling Tower atrium was a sea of blinding flashbulbs and deafening applause. The architecture was a testament to Julian's monumental ego, a soaring glass cathedral filled with indoor waterfalls, imported orchids, and hundreds of Chicago's elite. Julian stood at the crystal podium on the raised marble stage, wearing a flawless white tuxedo, basking in the adoration of the crowd. He was delivering a poignant, perfectly scripted speech about overcoming the tragic, violent betrayal of his wife, and channeling his grief into a foundation dedicated to urban renewal alongside his new partner, Silas Thorne. Thorne sat in the front row, dead, shark-like eyes scanning the crowd, a smug, untouchable presence, outside the towering glass doors. The media circus was in a frenzy. Clara stepped out of an armored cab. She did not wear the borrowed gray suit. She had utilized one of Eleanor's safe house caches to retrieve a dress of stark, unblemished, white silk. It was a deliberate, haunting mirror image of the dress she had been auctioned in on the yacht. But tonight, it was not a shroud. It was battle armor, beneath the delicate fabric, a microscopic, state-of-the-art FBI transmitter was taped securely against her collarbone. She walked past the barricades, the police officers, confused by the sudden appearance of the infamous fugitive out on bail, hesitated for a crucial second. That second was all Clara needed. The paparazzi recognized her instantly. The screams erupted, the flashes blinded the night, and the media surge physically pushed the security lines back. Clara rode the wave of chaos directly through the heavy glass doors and into the atrium. The moment she stepped into the light, a ripple of absolute, stunned silence swept across the massive room. The applause died instantly. The elite guests parted like the Red Sea, backing away from her as if she were a ghost. Julian stopped speaking mid-sentence. His hands gripped the edges of the crystal podium. For the first time in his life, his perfectly constructed mask slipped, revealing a flash of genuine, unadulterated shock. He looked at her in the white silk, and then he looked at the wall of news cameras broadcasting the event, live to millions. Clara did not stop walking. She kept her spine perfectly straight, one hand resting lightly and protectively over the curve of her stomach. She walked directly up the marble steps and onto the stage, stopping exactly 10 feet away from the podium. Silas Thorne's elite guards immediately materialized from the shadows, their hands hovering over their concealed weapons. But Thorne raised a single, subtle finger, halting them. He knew they could not execute a pregnant woman on live national television without initiating a federal war. They were paralyzed by the light. "Good evening, Julian," Clara said. Her voice was not amplified by a microphone, but it carried perfectly through the dead silent room. It was smooth, steady, and utterly fearless. Julian quickly recovered, his eyes narrowing into cold, venomous slits. He leaned into the microphone, instantly playing the victim. "Clara, you are violating the terms of your bail. This is a private event. Have you come to apologize for the blood on your hands, for the massacre you orchestrated?" Clara smiled. It was a terrifying, pitying smile. "No, Julian. I came here to tell the truth, but not to them." She gestured to the crowd. "I came to tell them the truth about you." She turned her gaze to Silas Thorne sitting in the front row. "Mr. Thorne, did you really think you were partnering with an equal? You are partnering with a bankrupt, desperate coward." A murmur of shock rippled through the elite crowd. Julian's face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. The public humiliation was a direct strike to his most sensitive nerve. "Shut your mouth, Clara," Julian hissed, stepping away from the microphone, his voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper meant only for her. "Security will drag you out of here in handcuffs in 10 seconds. "Security won't touch me," Clara replied, her voice remaining perfectly steady. In her earpiece, she heard a soft, static click followed by Dom's ragged voice. "I'm in the basement. Target located. 3 tangos down. 2 to go. Keep him talking." Clara took a step closer to Julian, entirely invading his space on the stage. She projected her voice just enough for the front row of journalists to hear every agonizing word. "You owe Silas Thorne $5 million. Julian, you didn't build an empire. You built a Ponzi scheme. And when the bill came due, you didn't have the spine to face it like a man. You sold your own wife at an offshore auction. You took a beating from Dominic Russo, crying on your own floor, begging for mercy. And then you forged financial documents and bought Chief Harrison to frame me. All because you were terrified that Thorne would realize what a pathetic, hollow puppet you truly are." The absolute silence in the atrium shattered into a cacophony of gasps and rapidly clicking camera shutters. The journalists were recording every word. Julian's chest heaved. His entire reality was fracturing. He was being humiliated, emasculated, and exposed in front of the very people he demanded worship from. His narcissistic rage completely overrode his logic. He forgot the cameras. He forgot the crowd. He only saw the woman he owned, daring to defy him. "You stupid, ungrateful bitch," Julian screamed, his voice echoing off the glass walls, completely devoid of his polished charm. "You think you can come into my house and dismantle me? I built this city. Thorne doesn't own me. I used him. I orchestrated the entire gala massacre. I planted that envelope on Russo's dead mercenary. I bought the chief of police because they all work for me. I put you in that concrete cell, and I will put you back in it. You are nothing without me. You are my property." In the deafening, horrific silence that followed Julian's explosive, screaming confession, Clara's earpiece crackled one final time. "Eleanor is secure. The basement is clear." And him, Clara looked at Julian's red, sweating face. She did not raise her voice. She did not gloat. She simply reached up to the collar of her white silk dress and pulled out the small, blinking FBI transmitter. holding it up for the cameras to see. I am nobody's property, Julian, Clara said softly, her voice broadcasting clearly to the federal command center outside. And you just confessed to domestic terrorism, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit murder on a live. Recorded Federal Wire. Julian stared at the blinking red light of the transmitter. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him a ghastly, hollow white. He looked out at the crowd. The senators were backing away. Silas Thorne was already standing up, turning his back on Julian, signaling his men to quietly exit the building, abandoning the sinking ship. Before Julian could move, the massive glass doors of the atrium were thrown open violently. But this time, it was not the media. Dozens of FBI tactical agents in heavy combat gear swarmed into the room, their assault rifles raised, completely bypassing the corrupt local police. The regional director of the FBI walked directly up the marble steps of the stage, flanked by armed agents. Julian Sterling, the director announced, his voice booming with absolute, inescapable authority. You are under arrest for federal racketeering, conspiracy, and domestic terrorism. Put your hands behind your back. Julian stumbled backward, his knees hitting the crystal podium. He looked at the agents, and then he looked at Clara. There was no rage left in his eyes, only the stark, pathetic terror of a man who realized his velvet cage had just slammed shut from the inside. The agents grabbed him, slamming him roughly against the podium to secure the handcuffs. Clara did not stay to watch him cry. She turned her back on the monster, walking calmly down the steps of the stage. She moved through the stunned, parting crowd, walking toward the side exit of the atrium, standing in the shadows of the doorway, bleeding, battered, but holding the fierce, brilliant Eleanor Briggs upright, was Dominic Russo. Clara walked into the shadows, wrapping her arms around both of them, the blinding lights of the cameras fading into the distance as they finally stepped into the quiet, absolute safety of the night. 5 years later, the heavy, rusted iron doors of the maximum security federal penitentiary slammed shut with a definitive, echoing finality, locking Julian Sterling into a 6 by 8 foot concrete cell for the rest of his natural life. Silas Thorne and the corrupt police chief shared his fate, entirely dismantled by the unyielding prosecution led by Eleanor Briggs. But this story is no longer about them. The brilliant morning sun cast a warm, golden glow over the massive glass atrium of a newly constructed complex in the heart of downtown Chicago. It was a building of light, transparency, and unyielding strength. Etched into the frosted glass doors were the words, "The 4B Foundation, Sanctuary and Legal Advocacy for Survivors." Inside the bustling, sunlit lobby, Clara stood at a sleek wooden podium. She was not wearing ivory silk. She wore a sharp, emerald green suit, radiating a quiet, undeniable power. Her face carried the faint, imperceptible lines of a woman who had seen the abyss and climbed back out, but her eyes were bright and filled with an absolute, unshakable peace. Resting comfortably on her hip, clutching a small stuffed bear and watching the crowd with wide, curious dark eyes, was her 4-year-old daughter, Eliana. The room was filled with hundreds of people survivors, advocates, pro bono lawyers trained by Eleanor Briggs, and medical professionals. They had all come to witness the inauguration of the largest, most comprehensively funded domestic violence sanctuary in the country. The funding had not come from a corrupt billionaire. It had come from the absolute, total liquidation of Dominic Russo's criminal empire over the past 5 years, under the relentless, lawful supervision of the federal government. Dom had since dismantled his family's blood-soaked legacy, converting every illicit casino and shadow account into legitimate urban development and the endowment of the 4B Foundation. Clara leaned toward the microphone, adjusting Eliana on her hip. The crowd fell into a deeply respectful silence. "They tell us that trauma breaks us," Clara began, her voice warm, resonant, and echoing with the hard-won wisdom of a survivor. "They tell us that when the mirrors of our lives shatter, we must spend the rest of our days carefully walking on the broken glass, trying to piece together a reflection that will never look the same. But I am here to tell you today that some broken mirrors do not need to be repaired. They need to be swept away and replaced. She looked out over the sea of faces, her gaze lingering on the women in the front row who were just beginning their own harrowing journeys of healing. Our scars do not dictate our future. They are the intricate maps of how we survive the dark. We are taught to fear power, to cower before money, to believe that the systems built to protect us are infallible. But true equality is not just a law written in a dusty courthouse. It is the fundamental, absolute human respect we must demand in our own homes, in our own relationships, and over our own bodies. Healing is not a quiet surrender. It is a fierce, intellectual, and courageous reclamation of the self. Clara smiled, pressing a gentle kiss to Eliana's dark curls. The little girl giggled, the sound light and musical in the vast atrium. No human being is property, Clara declared, her voice ringing with the clarity of a struck bell. No pain is too deep to heal, provided you are given the safety to breathe, and no voice, no matter how long it has been silenced in the shadows, is ever too small to shatter a velvet cage. The crowd erupted into a thunderous, prolonged standing ovation. There were tears, cheers, and a profound, collective sense of liberation filling the sunlit room. Clara stepped back from the podium, letting the applause wash over her. Holding her daughter tightly against her chest, she turned her gaze to the side of the stage. Standing in the shadows, leaning casually against a structural pillar, was Dominic Russo. He was wearing a simple, dark suit. The harsh, terrifying edges of the apex predator he once was had softened, replaced by the quiet, grounded strength of a man who had fought a war against his own legacy and won. He watched Clara as she spoke. He did not look at her with the possessive, hungry eyes of a man guarding his property. He looked at her with absolute, unwavering reverence. He looked at her as an equal, a partner, and a queen. Dom pushed off the pillar and walked up the short steps to the stage. He didn't care about the cameras or the crowd. He wrapped his arms around Clara and Eliana, burying his face in the space between his wife and the little girl who called him her father. Clara closed her eyes, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady, calm rhythm of his heartbeat. The nightmare was a ghost of the past, fully exorcised by the light. The morning sun continued to rise over the sanctuary, casting away the last remaining shadows, welcoming a future built on absolute freedom and a love that required no cages. And so, the heavy iron doors close on Julian Sterling. But the true resonance of Clara's journey echoes far beyond the confines of a courtroom or a criminal empire. As we step back from the shadows of Chicago's underworld, it is vital to reflect on the profound lessons embedded within this story. Clara's nightmare reminds us that the most dangerous prisons are rarely made of iron bars. They are often velvet cages, gilded in wealth and hidden behind closed doors. Abuse is not always announced with a raised fist. It frequently begins with isolation, gaslighting, and the slow, methodical erosion of a person's autonomy. Julian Sterling represented the darkest aspects of coercive control, treating a human life as property to be traded, manipulated, and ultimately destroyed for his own fragile ego. The story forces us to look past the charming facades that society often worships and recognize the silent battles being fought by those who are made to feel entirely powerless. But Clara's survival is a testament to the indestructible nature of the human spirit. She teaches us that healing is not a passive surrender to a savior, but a fierce, intellectual, and courageous reclamation of the self. When Dominic Russo smashed through those heavy oak doors, he did not simply rescue a victim. He provided a sanctuary where she could safely rebuild her own armor. Dominic's character challenges the traditional tropes of power and masculinity. He possessed the arsenal of an entire criminal syndicate, yet he understood that true strength lies in restraint, respect, and the absolute requirement of consent. He disarmed himself to make her feel safe, proving that true love is never rooted in ownership. It is about standing beside someone, not standing over them. Ultimately, This narrative is a powerful declaration that trauma does not dictate our future. The scars we carry are not brands of weakness. They are the intricate maps of how we survived the dark. Clara did not just survive. She weaponized her grief and her intellect to shatter a corrupt system, transforming her deepest pain into a beacon of hope for countless others through the 4B Foundation. She reminds every listener that no human being is property, no system is too powerful to be challenged, and no voice is too small to shatter a velvet cage. If you or someone you know is walking through the dark, remember Clara's resilience. You do not have to piece together a broken mirror that reflects only your pain. You have the power to sweep away the glass and build an entirely new life in the light. This content is researched, constructed, and manually edited by us to bring meaning and lessons.